Our guests today are Jace, Emily, and Dedeker from the Multiamory Podcast, and they have recently published the Multiamory book. And so we're here to talk to them about that and all things non-monogamy. Welcome to the show, guys.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, I just want to say, first of all, that I consider this to be a treat for our listeners in that your podcast has been a great source of information for us when we've hit certain roadblocks. We just go into that vast library that you've created and pick out exactly what we need to help us through the issue or to shed some light on it. So I'm excited for our listeners and excited for ourselves because now we're going to get a custom Multiamory podcast made just for us because that's all the questions.
So for the sake of our listeners who maybe have not heard of you or your podcast, can you give us a brief introduction to yourselves and to your work?
Yeah, I'll dive into that. So the Multiamory Podcast, we started it back in 2014, and it is a research-backed relationship advice show that centers non-traditional relationships. So we do a lot of talking about non-monogamy, but also trying to be as inclusive as possible of a wide variety of relationship types. I mean, you know, two of us are non-monogamous and have been for several years, and Emily's been in a monogamous relationship for almost as long as we've been running the show. So we come from a blended perspective. And so it's a lot of, you know, taking a lot of the relationship research that's out there, a lot of the traditional wisdom, the popular marriage books, and seeing how does this translate to non-traditional relationships, and some vice versa as well, looking at what's the community wisdom from people who've been practicing different flavors of non-monogamy for years, and what, you know, kind of non-monogamy cultural things could be helpful for people who are in monogamous relationships. That's, you know, doesn't cover the entire scope of our show, but that's probably it in a nutshell.
Right. So I'm curious, you've done the podcast now for 9 years. You've got over 400 episodes. Is that right?
Yep.
Yeah, correct.
So
just recorded 430.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, that's amazing. So why write a book?
Wow. Yeah, I think it was really important to us to put this information out there because a lot of people would rather read or give this information to their loved ones or somebody that's important to them in a written form rather than just, you know, listening to it on a show or having to comb through, as you said, all of the 400 plus episodes that we have and finding exactly what it was that they needed. We also have a really dedicated, phenomenal community of patrons that actually asked for our book when we reached a certain amount of patrons. I think it was 1,000 or something. We asked everyone, what was it that, you know, we could give back to you? Is it an app? Is it, you know, something else? Is it a book? And overwhelmingly people asked for a book. So I do think that there's a real need for this information in this form. And again, our book isn't a polyamory 101 book. It's really a book of a collection of our most popular tools that we've created over the 7 years of doing, the 9 years. Yes.
I forgot about a whole 2 years.
I know.
In there.
Yeah, you're right. The 9 years that we've been doing the show. So we hope that people who are in multiple relationship styles will get to use the tools in the book.
Yeah. And again, there's something important for us in writing the book about, you know, the people who are usually left out of the conversation in relationship books, because, yeah, they do tend to fall into this camp of like, you know, all the books put out by the Gottman Institute or, you know, whatever the latest like pop psych book on relationships is or whatever Esther Perel puts out. And then there's like the small sliver of like, well, here's all the books for relationship weirdos, right, over in the corner here. And like with the book, as we do with the show, it's always trying to bridge that gap.
It's interesting that you went from an audio format and then having the written format requested, because we went in the other direction. So we started writing a blog in 2015 and, you know, had kind of the same process where we asked our readers and our patrons, you know, what else would you like to see from us? And so many people said, why aren't you doing a podcast? so we went the other way.
Yeah, I think it's so many people. Oh, no problem. I think so many people just really want this information out there in some form or another, and it is so wonderful that we have podcasts like yours and like ours and so many others out there, because when we started, it was basically us and one other podcast, and now it's just blossomed into so many amazing ones.
Yeah. One of the things your book talks about, and that you guys have talked about in a couple different episodes so beautifully, is the idea of boundaries. And it's become such a buzzword. You know, everybody's talking about boundaries in the same way everyone's talking about traumas and triggers. And I wonder if you could help clarify for us some of the things that people get wrong when they think about boundaries.
I think I would start off by just clarifying it's not so much about getting it wrong. It's more just that boundaries is something that's, generally speaking, not very well defined. Like, people use that word because they heard at some point boundaries are good. Therefore, if what I'm doing is a boundary, that's good. And so they'll kind of try to fit a lot of stuff into what they'd call a boundary, so that it's like, oh, look, I did a good thing and you can't criticize me for it. And I'm not saying that to mean that people are doing this like maliciously, that they're like, ooh, I'm going to sneak my stuff in, call it a boundary. It's not like that, but just that we're all trying to find some way to make this easier, because relating to other people is hard. It's complicated, and it takes a lot of work and a lot of emotional effort and a lot of thought. And there are not a lot of clear black and whites. And so basically, to say like what they're doing wrong is kind of to say wrong in using what we would call a boundary. So for us, the big distinction we make is that a boundary is something that you put in place that's by you. So you're the one who came up with it. It's to protect you, yourself, and that it's 100% enforceable by you alone. Like, it doesn't require anybody else to do anything in order for you to enforce it. And that's the challenging part. That's the tricky part. And I do want to clarify that not everyone uses boundaries that way. So I don't want you to run around being like, you're saying it wrong. But just, if you're going to talk about boundaries the way we've found it useful to define it, that's the definition. An example of something that someone might call a boundary that we would say is not, based on our definition, is something like, I have a boundary that you don't put your socks on the floor at night, like your dirty socks, you don't leave them out, and you keep violating my boundary. What the hell? You gotta get in line and follow my boundary. To us, that kind of goes outside of, well, that's not a boundary. That's just, I want you to do this thing, right? Like, maybe I want to make it a rule, maybe it's a request, whatever it is. And the reason for us that it's not a boundary is, one, it's saying, I want you to do something. It's not having anything to do with what I do or my own behavior. And then two, is that they're not enforcing it. And that's the other part for us, is that a boundary is an absolute. It's kind of like your last line of defense. So if we were to make that a boundary, and I'm not saying this is a good boundary, but if we were, it would be something like, I have a boundary that it's unhealthy and bad for me to live in a place where socks get left on the floor. So therefore, if that happens, I'm going to find somewhere else to live. I'm going to get out of this situation, because that's the only thing I actually have control over in that situation. Now, this is ridiculous, right? This is a ridiculous boundary to have, I think. I apologize if one of your listeners actually has a really strong, fear or something of the phobia of socks on the floor. I apologize, and in your case, maybe it's justified. But the idea is
Jake,
that
I might jump in if we try to get like maybe what's a more realistic version of a boundary in that situation. I think there's a lot of different examples, because it could be something like, okay, if my partner leaves socks on the floor, I'm not going to pick them up. Like, I'm not going to go out of my way in my day to make sure that we get them all off the floor, right? Or it might be, if my partner leaves socks on the floor, I'm going to ask them to pick it up, instead of stewing in resentment all day, waiting for him to finally figure out that he left his socks on the floor. It could be, if I notice that there's socks on the floor, I'm going to bring it up when we have our next check-in about how things are going with household chores and things like that. So there's a lot of different ways that it can look. Jace, of course, gave the most extreme example. The whole point being that it's all about your own behavior and what you can control. So yeah, go ahead, Jace.
To just clarify a little further on that the idea behind this, because I think it sometimes sounds a little bit harsh to people. They're like, oh gosh, so you're advocating for these super harsh, like almost like an ultimatum of like, you better do this thing or not do this thing or I leave. And instead, we will often say, if you're hitting up against that boundary, like you're already way off base for a good, healthy relationship. And that the idea is that the boundary is like that thing that protects you and keeps you safe and helps you to avoid situations that are dangerous for you, whether that's emotionally or physically or mentally or whatever, not as like a constant guideline for living your life. It's like if you drove your car around by like, oh, the bumper's there to protect me, so I'll just scrape that along the side of the road as I go so I know where I'm going. It's kind of like that idea.
Right. So I would imagine the big challenge is how you communicate those boundaries. So yes, it's within your control. You're going to respond in a particular way to a particular happenstance. But ideally, to avoid that confrontation in the first place, you want to communicate it in a way that is loving but firm. Would that be an accurate way to put it?
So I have a whole TED talk that I could do about this question, honestly, because yeah, when we talk about this topic, often the natural follow-up question is like, okay, so like, how do I communicate my boundaries? Or like, once I've figured out what my boundaries are, and we do have a great exercise in the book for figuring out what your boundaries are, you know, when am I supposed to communicate? Or how do I tell people? How do I let people know what the updated terms and conditions are? And I'm very much of the mind that like, yes, certain boundaries need to be communicated, but also certain boundaries, honestly, because they only apply to your own behavior, it could be better in some situations to not communicate them. Now, the example that I often give is I have a family member who, for many years, I'd always get upset because when I would get into conversations with this family member, they'd always say critical things about my mother. And it was annoying, but I didn't feel like there was enough of a good communication there for me to be like, hey, this upsets me. Can you please not do that? I felt like this is going to be asking for a fight. Like, it's not going to be a good situation. And so when I kind of did some boundary work around that, I realized, well, my boundary is like, I don't want to engage in conversations that are critical about my mom. Like, I don't want to just pile on my mom. So like, when this person brings this up, I'm just going to change the subject. I'm just going to be like, oh yeah, she's doing great. And then let's move on to the next subject. Right. And for me to take out the time to sit down the family member and be like, listen, here's the deal. This is my boundary and this is what I'm going to be doing, again, is probably asking for another fight, because unfortunately the world we live in is like, not everyone has been to therapy and is super inundated in like therapy language. Not everyone is going to be like, thank you for letting me know what your boundaries are. I'm so glad. So for me, that was my personal choice, right? Where I'm like, as long as I'm able to enforce it for myself, it doesn't necessarily mean I need to have their buy-in. Now, that's not necessarily every single situation. Of course, there's going to be situations where it's better to communicate up front, this is what my boundaries are. But in some situations, if it really is just about your own behavior and like there isn't even necessarily a benefit to having to communicate it, I say you don't have to.
But yes, there are situations where I think it is important, especially if you find yourself with a partner coming up against something over and over again. Like, for instance, something that I talk about in the book is, if you have a boundary of, or you find yourself getting really triggered or hurt or scared or whatever by maybe your partner and you raising voices in an argument and just going at each other in that way, a boundary for you may be, hey, I'm going to walk out of the room for 10 minutes, 15 minutes until I'm physiologically less activated and until hopefully you are as well. But obviously you can't, dictate what they're doing. But for yourself, that if you take the time to kind of let yourself get a little bit more calm, then I'm going to return to the conversation then. But a boundary would include essentially, I'm going to leave until I am in that better state. And so I think in that scenario, it would be a great idea to tell a partner, hey, I've seen this happening over and over again in our relationship. It's really challenging for me. And tell them in that moment, just so you're aware, something for me to help me through it is I'm going to leave the room and not come back until I feel like I'm in a better spot.
As opposed to just walking out on them mid-conversation. Right?
Yeah,
so
I think it's better to relay it there for sure.
Sure. So maybe we need to talk about the differences between boundaries, which are kind of, you unilaterally holding a line, and agreements, where you cooperatively come up with things that will help your relationship work more smoothly, and, maybe some guidelines that can help you as you're negotiating changes in your relationship dynamic. So what's the difference between a boundary and an agreement or a rule?
Yeah, I actually have our little definition that we created for the book right here, so I'll read it to you. An agreement is a mutual decision between partners that establishes particular behaviors to facilitate trust, accommodate each other's preferences, and provide some predictability as to what they can each expect. So I think the difference there is this is something that you're coming to together, that you're collaborating on. It's not about you and how you are specifically keeping yourself safe, but it's something together that you can create a decision or an agreement, let's check in with each other before bed. If we are at another partner's house, for instance, let's make an agreement to do that. Now, I think the difference between that and a rule, Jace often says on the show, like, a rule generally makes it seem as though, like, if it's broken, then there's going to be consequences. And we say that as well, that a rule is a guideline or limit that restricts one or multiple people's behavior. If the rule is broken, consequences ensue. So I think that's a difference there as well, that a rule sort of feels a little bit more like, shit, if I don't do this thing, then my partner's going to be really upset, and I'm going to have something happen to me after the fact, essentially. So I think there is a difference there. One is potentially more collaborative. One is more like, if you don't do this thing, there's going to be trouble.
Right. So what happens if you can't come to an agreement? So if you are butting heads, you're on opposite sides of a line, and you get into that pattern of conflict, and the agreement is just not readily available. What do you do? What are some tools that you would use in that situation?
Well, I'm so glad you asked, because this is my entire job, working with individuals and couples and triads and more, right?
We're just looking for free therapy right now, actually.
Sure. Gosh. Yeah. Well, so if I'm imagining that I'm sitting down with a couple, and because this is so common, right? Like, I want X, the other person wants Y. We can't find any compromise. We can't find a way to collaborate. So my training for couples therapy is through the Gottman Institute, which is an institute that's been doing relationship research for many, many years. And something really helpful that came from them is this idea that, like, when we find ourselves in repetitive conflict, so let's say there's like a particular topic of contention, and let's say the example is, we'll go with Emily's example, like, hey, I would really like it if you send me a goodnight text, even if you're spending the night at another partner's house. And then maybe the other person is like, well, I don't know, I don't want to be on the hook for that. Sometimes I fall asleep and I forget, and like, I don't want to be in trouble. Sometimes I like to just unplug my phone when I'm with this partner, whatever it is, right? And if what happens is, like, we both dig in our heels, that's probably a symptom that there's something deeper and more existential going on. And this is any kind of conflict. It doesn't have to be about coming to agreements, but it's like, if we truly cannot find a way to step towards the middle, toward each other, there's probably something deeper down within this. And so what the work that I will do with couples is figuring out, like, what's actually underneath this? Is there some kind of dream or vision that you had of, like, how this aspect of non-monogamy would go, right? Is there some kind of way that one person was hoping to feel, So it's like, maybe the person asking for the good night text is just hoping to feel more connected and safe and included and not left out of the loop, and to feel like they have a ritual, like a stabilizing ritual to come back to. And maybe the other person wants to feel like, I'm free and I'm autonomous and I can be in the moment with my partner, and I'm, I'm not on the hook for something, And so it's, a lot of exploring of, like, okay, where does that come from? What is the vision that you hold for this? Like, does this go all the way back to previous relationships or childhood? So that's sort of like the fact finding areas here. And this is kind of like work that I don't think you have to do with a therapist or a coach. Like, this is work that you can do with your partner, as long as you're able to listen attentively and open-heartedly and with curiosity to actually understand where does this come from for your partner, right? And be able to come to a sense of mutual understanding. So that's kind of the deeper work that you can do around this. But something that we like to recommend to people is to put your scientist pants on and come up with a temporary agreement that you can run as an experiment. So as in, like, okay, we can't 100% see eye to eye on this. Is there something temporary that we could try for 2 weeks? That we can both tolerate just enough. So, with the texting example, maybe it is, let's experiment with, you send a good night text if it's just, I don't know, just like you're spending one night, but if it's a whole weekend, then I will expect to not hear from you until you come back after the weekend. Like, I don't know what it is, right? We decide, like, let's try something. And then we set a time to check in and say, how did that go? What did we learn? Did we both hate that the entire time? Were there parts of that did seem to work? Okay, cool. Can we take that and run with it? And can we add to it? Things like that. So this dovetails really nicely into one of our tools in the book. One of the tools that we developed years ago, we talk about on the show all the time, which is our radar, which is a template for having a regular relationship check-in. Because we think that having a regular check-in is a pretty fundamental ritual that can support relationships in general, but I think especially relationships where you are transitioning into some different format of the relationship, right? Opening up a relationship or closing a relationship or trying a different flavor of non-monogamy, is that you need that regular check-in container for being able to run these experiments and give feedback. So again, I think that, provided if you're doing that work to like actually mutually understand each other, of like, what are the stakes for my partner? Can I compassionately empathize with that and validate the stakes for my partner in this? And then can we try something temporary and then just see how it goes and then kind of iterate from there? Of course, that's not a guarantee of success. Sometimes we still may not see to eye with particular things. Sometimes we may still need to compromise on things we weren't expecting to compromise on. But again, I think like Emily was saying, sometimes the issue with rules and just kind of laying down the law is it sets us up to be parents to each other or to be police to each other. And if we can bring in a spirit of being collaborative scientists, at least we're coming to each other as adults and interfacing as adults who are trying to be on the same team, if that makes sense.
Right. First of all, I want to say I'm very excited that there is such a thing as scientist pants. So we're going to get a link to
Didn't
where
you know?
can buy them. Yeah, no, I found out now, Dedeker, so thank you. And we're going to put a link in the show notes after where people can buy them. Second of all, one of the interesting things I heard on one of your episodes, and I think it was Jace who mentioned it, is that conflict one would feel in terms of perhaps reaching an agreement and following the terms of the agreement and then that being counter to spontaneity. So I'm wondering, was that text late at night with the other partner, was that a spontaneous expression of interest in me and my feelings, or was it someone following the rules to get a gold star? Mm-hmm. And there may not be a way around that, but I'm just wondering if you've come up with an approach that addresses that sense of conflict one might feel.
Yeah. And
what to do when agreements are broken. So if it really is an agreement, not a rule that you've both agreed to, but one of you decides on their own, this time I don't really want to agree to the agreement, then what? So I guess we've got a two-part question there.
Yeah. I mean, those both bring up a similar thing though, right? And that when we talk about agreements and when we talk about things like doing a relationship check-in, we're basing all of this off the assumption that both people in this relationship do want to do right by each other and do want to do what they can to be loving to the other person, while of course still respecting their own beliefs and values and things like that, right? So there's always going to be this little bit of a push-pull there. So that's actually one of the reasons why that monthly check-in, that radar check-in, is so useful, because it makes it so you don't have to decide once now, and now you've signed this contract and you're stuck. That it's instead we're evolving this together, right? We have times where we can both weigh in on this. So to go to your example there, right, of like, yes, if you try to make rules for everything, or even if you call them agreements, if you try to make them for everything, then there is that weird thing of like, yeah, they sent me a text, but they just did it because that's our agreement or that's our rule. And so now you've kind of set up a situation where when they do it, we've maintained neutral. And when they don't do it, it's bad. Rather than if there were not that expectation at all, when they do it, oh, hey, positive. We won some happiness points for that. And if they don't do it, maybe you're a little disappointed, but it's not quite the same like hit of negativity. Now that's not like follow these 3 steps and now your problem's solved, but more it's something to think about of if you feel like the only way your partner is going to consider you or value you or be concerned about your feelings is if you had to spell out all the exact things that they need to do, that's actually a much deeper, much bigger problem. And I think that goes back to, again, with the boundaries thing. If people feel like, oh, but I'm not getting what I need, so I need there to be something stronger, like a boundary. It's actually kind of, we're covering up that there's actually a much bigger issue here, that if you're with someone who is just not willing or not interested in doing those things for you, as hard as that is to accept, this might just not be a good relationship. And so that's one of the other things we say a lot on this show is it's okay to break up. That you don't like need to have enough reason to break up. It's like if you're not happy and your partner is not valuing you, that's not a relationship that you should be in, really, for either of you. Like you're not doing them a favor by staying in that relationship either, at least in my opinion.
I think another fundamental part of this, especially if we're talking about non-monogamy specifically, is that trust is a huge pillar here, right? And what I mean when I say trust is it's so important to know that because the unique situations that non-monogamy puts us in is instead of just acting like a hive mind, instead of just being like the couple as the unit, we're acting as individuals, right? Especially if you're dating separately or choosing to date separately. And so that puts us in a unique situation of, okay, my partners and I are going to be making choices that benefit our own interests independently. But where trust comes in is I need to trust that even though my partner is making choices that benefit themselves individually, that I also know they're making choices that benefit me too. Like they're watching my back, that they're maintaining that balance, that tricky balance. It is tricky. And something that comes up all the time with the people that I work with when people have a lot of angst and distress around their partner dating separately is if we feel like there's no object permanence to ourselves or the relationship. So if we feel like, oh, the minute that I'm not in the room with my partner, they're just making choices. They've completely forgotten every agreement we've made. It's all just about the person they're in front of and what they want in that moment. It's like that, to me, that seems like that's a symptom like we need to build up more trust here, right? And now some of building trust, especially in the early days of opening up a relationship or making a transition, it could be relying on, again, maybe temporary, maybe experimental rituals in order to support that sense of relationship security and trust. So for somebody's relationship, that goodnight text ritual, that could be part of building up that trust, right? And at a certain point, that could feel like training wheels, and where it's like, okay, no, I feel like I've developed enough of a backlog of security and trust that, yeah, we mostly text each other goodnight, but if my partner sometimes forgets, it's not a huge deal or a huge betrayal. The way that it may feel when it's the early days and it feels shaky and we're still feeling out that sense of, do I have object permanence? Is my partner making choices that also thinks about me? And were you going to jump in?
Yeah, I just was interested in potentially looking at something that is from our repair shop framework, which is looking at history, looking at stories that we're telling ourselves. It's a framework essentially for going back after a fight and sort of dissecting and discussing what it is that happened. And again, like I said earlier, ideally you are in a physiological state that is not heightened. in order to have those types of conversations. But it's very important, I think, in a lot of these questions that you're asking, that you do get really curious about what it is that's going on underneath all of these decisions that you're making. And if it's a question of whether or not I see my partner and they don't want to abide by this agreement that we have, I would start fundamentally at, like, why is that happening? What is the story or the history or the reasoning behind why my partner wouldn't want to do that? Am I telling myself something that maybe isn't actually there? Are they having a trauma response to something that occurred in their past? Is, this really challenging for them for whatever X, Y, or Z reason? I would want to try to, again, come together, like what Dedeker said, turn towards my partner and really get curious as to what it is that's going on with them. Because so often I think we see our partners as a combatant or an enemy or someone that we have to win against or any of those things. And if we can hopefully shy away from that mentality and go towards, this is somebody that I love and care about and that I choose to be in relationship with every single day, and therefore they do have my best interest, and they also, I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt first, or assume good intent first, because that is the person that I love and they don't want to hurt me. Now, if that's not the case, that's another problem, but I like to hopefully go there initially and start with that as opposed to something combative or angry or you did this thing to me.
And I'm sorry to keep piling on to this topic. It's just a topic that gets us so excited.
Near and dear to our hearts.
Near and dear to our hearts. That this, again, that uncovering what's going on and what's going on deeper, it can be vulnerable and it can be embarrassing, right? So again, to take our example, it could be like, oh, I feel so scared that, like, if my partner forgets to send me a good night text, or if they refuse to send me a good night text, like, what that leads to is, like, they've forgotten about me and I'm not important and I'm going to die alone, or the person who's pushing back against that, it could be, well, I'm afraid that if I have to pick up my phone next to this hot person who's in bed with me and I say, oh, I'm going to text my partner, that they're going to instantly dump me and walk out the door and, like, leave me high and dry, and it's, the fears can be irrational, but they're also valid. And so sometimes it requires going to that level when you are uncovering these things.
Right. So I'm curious, because so much of the problem often is rhetorical. It's happening at the level of language even, and not so much at the relationship or human connection. And you have a concept called microscripts about kind of interfering with those patterns and setting off in a new direction. I wonder, that sounds like a great tool to me, and I wonder if you can illuminate our audience on to what microscripts are and how they can be used.
Especially as relates to an anxious and avoidant attacher.
Oh,
yeah.
Good.
Yeah, I love microscripts. They're something that I use all the time. They're cool because they're particularly effective to use with a partner, but they can even be useful just for yourself as well. But basically, yeah, you described it well, where the idea is that you come up with some little thing, that's your microscript, some little thing that you say, but it might not even be something you say. It could be like a certain pose that you strike, or a little dance that you do, or a little song that you sing, or something, right? It's some small thing that encapsulates a bigger idea, and also that helps interrupt your typical patterns. So an example of this, let's see, this is one that we talk about in the book, that is, imagine the situation where you and your partner are in the kitchen and one person asks the other, oh, hey, could you take out the recycling? Like, no one really likes taking out the recycling, right? So it's kind of that, like, okay. And maybe I'm not like saying, oh, you jerk for making me do that, but I'm like, I don't want to, but I will. But to that other person, that might feel like, well, geez, I'm just asking for help and now you're making a big deal out of it and I feel shitty now. even though like no one really meant for anyone else to feel shitty, it just kind of happened. And especially if this happens over time, you can fall into this pattern where it's like that well-worn track on the road that the cart just falls right into, and there it goes. So in that case, those people could realize, okay, hey, we've identified there's this thing that keeps happening. Let's try to break that pattern. And so a microscript is one way to do that. And the one that we use as an example in the book is just saying ready, and maybe like striking a little like superhero pose to go with it or something, right? Or it could be a little like dance that you do or something. But what it does is it gives you a way to, in a shorthand, say, obviously I don't want to do this thing, but I am happy to do it for you to help take care of our house or to help take care of you or whatever it is. And so that's what I mean about like it contains something bigger. That all I'm saying is ready, and maybe I'm even like ready. Like maybe I'm really just like tired. I'm like ready, okay. But having that microscript at least helps signal a little bit of like, yeah, we've talked about this. I know that you're not asking me something unreasonable. You know that I want to help you. We all realize no one likes taking out the recycling, but I can do that. And even if you forget, your other partner can be like, you mean ready, right? And then you're like, right, ready. Because you've talked about it beforehand, and you now have one word or one gesture that means that whole conversation. And that's what I think is so cool about it.
To tie it to, since you asked about like the anxious behaviors, anxious attachment, avoidant attachment, it reminds me of a couple that I worked with where, you know, if I remember the details correctly, it was kind of a situation where they'd been non-monogamous from the beginning of their relationship. You know, they agreed to date separately, but you know, the anxious person had a hard time when their partner was off on a date, especially if they were traveling with somebody or a long time. But they had agreed, like, when we're with other partners, we're going to respect that time, right? And not blow up each other's phones, you know, unless it's truly an emergency or whatever, or if it's just like a little check-in or whatever. And so what they came up with was, I would call this a microscript, was when the anxious partner was feeling like, oh gosh, okay, I know everything's okay. I know this is within our agreements, but I just am feeling a little wobbly and I just need a little bit of reassurance, basically. I haven't shared this with you, Jason, Emily, but like, so this person would text a pufferfish emoji to their partner. The idea being kind of like, are you there? Can you pop up above the surface so I can see you? Was like the image that they came up with. And their partner would be able to take the time, and I think they would send back a little like mermaid emoji or something, and maybe something loving, right? But it didn't completely take them away from like their time with their partner. They didn't feel like they had to be like, oh gosh, I got to get on the phone right now to like calm down my anxious partner's, you know, feelings. And the anxious partner felt, you know, satisfied that it's like, okay, I've been acknowledged, I've been seen, you know, my partner and I are kind of playing this game together. We're playing out this script together, you know, to kind of float us through until we can actually reconnect in person. So again, you know, I love the microscripts tool because the fact, of course, it's customizable and it can scale, you know. And again, I will reiterate that it's like, you got to experiment with these things and play with these things, right? You may play around with as many emojis as you like and just be like, this is not cutting it, this is not working. We got to find something else, right? But we tried it for 2 weeks and used up every emoji in the book and couldn't find the right ones, right? So again, bringing that spirit to it is so important.
Right. Well, it sounded like you had been listening in on our conversations around the house in the past year, because your clients sound very much like us. So we had been non-monogamous from the beginning of our relationship. We're mostly, I guess, kind of like swingers, you know, friends with benefits for a decade. And everything was very comfy and easy. And, you know, we didn't really have to think about agreements and rules anymore because everything just felt so simple.
To you.
To me. But then we hit a wall when we started shifting from kind of a casual friends with benefits to a more poly separate relationship kind of dynamic. And we were not prepared for that. We thought we were pros at this. So what are some of the things? I love your metaphor about the training wheels, because we had taken the training wheels off and thrown them away. We didn't think we would ever need those training wheels again. And we're faced with the harsh reality that we needed them back on. So what are some of the tools you would give people like us who are in the middle of a transition from one relationship style to another? Are there certain kinds of certain areas that we should have agreements around, that you would advise all couples as they're negotiating these transitions? You should really talk about this stuff.
Oh, yeah. I mean, well, first of all, I just want to offer some empathy that, I mean, two things, right? That sometimes we can expect that we'll be able to generalize skills that we have across all situations, and sometimes that's not the case. It's a weird thing that you think about if you've ever trained a dog, that, you know, if you train the dog to sit when you're inside your house, you have to retrain the dog to sit when the dog is outside, because the dog's brain doesn't necessarily generalize. They think, okay, these are the conditions. The human has the treat. We're inside the kitchen. Okay, this is the time that I sit. And then once you're outside, it's like, well, this isn't where we learn to sit, you know? So, and I know it feels silly to compare ourselves to dogs, but to a certain extent, some parts of our brains are like that. And some of our skills are like that, where it's harder to generalize. So that's like one thing that goes on. The other thing that may be going on, and that goes on for a lot of people, is as human beings, we are bad at predicting how we're going to feel about things in the future, which it's a fact that really gets under my skin. All of the research supports it. All of us think that we can predict how we're going to feel, and we are actually pretty bad at it once we're actually in the situation. And so that happens with a lot of people, you know, even people who are very experienced with a particular flavor of non-monogamy. And I don't set this up as in to imply, oh, well, you know, polyamory is the harder version. That's the level up from swinging. Like, no, I see this with people who've been polyamorous for many years, then deciding they're going to play together for the first time and thinking the same thing, right? Oh, we're old pros at this. We have all the tools. And then you get into this entirely new context. It's like, oh, wait. So I think that's part of it as well, is that sometimes we can be caught off guard by the way we feel about these things, both negatively and positively. I know in my own experience, playing around with many different flavors of non-monogamy, there have been many experiences where I'm like, that sounds way too scary, and I'm going to be miserable in that situation. And then I'm there and I'm like, oh, actually, this is great. I love this. So I think that's part of it. There are probably 6 billion things that we could say. You know, we have 430 episodes of a podcast for a reason, because there's just a lot, and it's always going to be context dependent. You know, maybe this is low hanging fruit, but it is kind of like communicate more than you think that you need to, go a little slower than you think that you need to. You need to strike a balance between, you know, a pretty common piece of advice is to move at the pace of the slowest person. And I do think that's really valid advice. And also, you know, if the slowest person is consenting and enthusiastic and wants to do this too, ideally the pace of the slowest person is also not a standstill as well, because we've seen that happen as well, you know, where just no change happens for years because the slowest person just doesn't want to do anything, right? And that maybe there's a different issue at play there. I think those would be my maybe top few. Em and Jace, would you jump in with any? Because there's, I mean, really though, there's just like so much.
Yeah, I appreciate the fact that you said that the training wheels came off and then maybe we needed to put them back on. Because I know when Jace and I opened up our monogamous relationship, after a time, I realized, hey, I actually am not super okay with this right at this moment. Can we become monogamous again for a little while? And then we did, and then I, you know, knew somebody from my past that I really wanted to go have sex with, and so I did that, and then, you know, kind of the rest is history. And sometimes it does take some external factor to be like, okay, wait a minute, now I kind of get it and can go there and can move in the direction that perhaps we wanted to before. So yeah, I'd say give yourself some grace and some understanding regarding the fact that it is hard and you never know necessarily what's going to bring up, feelings of possessiveness or feelings of, shit, I really don't like the idea of my partner being really intimate with this person in this very emotional way, which I've never seen before, or this person, I'm worried that they're going to bring out something in my partner that is something that I've never seen before, and that maybe they love so much that they're potentially going to leave me. I mean, all of those things are valid and understandable, and very things that happen to a lot of people out there. So I totally get it. And I would say, yeah, Dedeker's advice of just taking it slow, doing that internal work, having an abundance of communication and curiosity, again, about why it is that you are feeling certain things and where that's coming from, what your fears are. That vulnerability is huge.
Right. Emily, Jace, and Dedeker, I want to thank you for convening this evening on our podcast to give us what I hoped would happen, which was a custom Multiamory podcast made just for us and our listeners. It was really generous of your time for the three of you to get together and to share with us. So I want to close with one final question, and that is, all of us in the world of non-monogamy are curious, I think, about where our way of life has come from and maybe where it's going to. And you have these 9 years that you've been in a very public position in this world. And I wonder if you just have some observations, maybe about how far we've come. Maybe you dare to even make a prediction about where we're going in terms of society's embracing of a very different form of relating to each other.
Yeah, I mean, I'll start by just saying it's been amazing how much we have seen change, and how, I guess, fast when looking back at it. Maybe it didn't feel fast at the time, but to give you some perspective, when we started this podcast, one of the things we had to do right at the very beginning was debate, are we going to use our real names as ourselves on the podcast? Because at the time there was only one other non-monogamy polyamory podcast, and that was Polyamory Weekly. And Cunning Minx uses a fake name. And she has been doing that podcast for a very long time. They actually just announced that they're stopping the podcast, but she'd been doing it forever before we even started, right? So that podcast had been around for a million years in podcasting years. And also, she had a job that she felt like could be at risk if she were public about who she was. And so that makes total sense. And so for us coming along now a little bit later, also being a little bit younger, working in different industries, we had to still sit down and evaluate, and all living in Los Angeles at the time too, had to evaluate, is this something where we can use our own names? And we debated about it for a while and eventually decided, yes, we're going to use our actual names, because part of the message we want to give is this is just another way of doing relationships. It's not something that we feel ashamed of. And so we didn't want to give any indicators that we would feel ashamed, but we were afraid. And I think some of our parents and some partners and things have been worried about that over the years, of like, you've ruined your chance of, you've probably lost jobs because of this, or you can never run for political office, or, whatever thing came to mind, right? Of like, oh, you've really made a big mistake here. You've messed up your other careers, even if you don't see it yet. There's that fear. And then also with the podcast, we had a little bit of a challenge getting people to, getting more listeners at first, because our listeners didn't want to share about it on Facebook or social media, because that would mean outing themselves. And a lot of people weren't as comfortable with that. And so fast forward 9 years, one is that there's just a lot more polyamory podcasts out there, and a lot more non-monogamy podcasts in general. There's also a lot more cultural references to it. There have been several celebrities now who identify as some kind of non-monogamy. Like, all these things to make it go from this, you can't talk about that because who knows how people will react, to like, well, if I'm in a certain situation where I feel like I might be at risk, I might want to keep this secret. Like if I have vindictive, parents-in-law who I worry are going to try to take my kids away from me or something because of this, and I live in a more conservative area. Like there's still realistic things of why you would want to keep this secret. But I think a lot more people now feel comfortable sharing publicly, posting about it. I think that the whole Gen Z thing of just saying like, look, y'all have systems that just suck, so we're going to break out of all of those, I think has kind of helped all of us to be like, yeah, but look, there's some permission here to just say, yeah, screw it. We're going to find a new path here. And so I think that's some of the big changes that we've seen. It's just a lot more dialogue about it, a lot more comfort people have. I found that even at my current job, which is working for a fairly old company that's not like, they're not, I wouldn't say they're conservative, but they're not progressive either. They're just kind of middle of the road corporate America. Everyone's just kind of like, oh, okay. Like if they find out or if it comes up in conversation, it's sort of like a non-thing. And I think that's, in a way, like that's a huge step from where we started this show, where that would have been a little more of a scandalous thing.
We're definitely seeing things shift on the political front. And of course, you know, often on the political front, that can be 2 steps forward, 1 step back, as we're seeing. And right now it's kind of dicey. But, you know, I remember, again, years ago when we first started the show, posting on my personal Facebook page about, you know, examples of, yeah, this kinky person lost custody of their child because they happened to be in a custody battle where there was a conservative judge who didn't understand what was going on, or this person literally got fired because they marched with the polyamory float in the Pride Parade. You know, there's no protections for relationship practices. And I remember back then, many years ago, you know, a lot of my normie friends posting being like, really? Like, why does anyone care about this? This is just like what people do in their bedroom. Like, really, we need to be worried about this. Up to, you know, just a few weeks ago, we had this really amazing episode where we had on Diana Adams, who's an attorney with the Chosen Family Law Center, and Dr. Heath Scheckinger, who is on the American Psychological Association's task force for consensual non-monogamy. Literally, their job is creating more resources, tools, pamphlets, training for mental health professionals to understand consensual non-monogamy and serve their patients better. And, you know, Diana Adams was also key in getting legislation passed out in Somerville, you know, for people to be able to have domestic partnership rights with more than one person. So, you know, we are seeing the tide shift. And again, nothing is guaranteed. There can always be a backslide. But I, you know, the more people who talk about these things, the more people who, you know, like yourselves, you know, create content and just talk very openly and plainly about the fact that this is normal and this is what we do in our relationships and it's okay, the better it's going to be. You know, the more that people in the mainstream get exposed and start to realize, I mean, the statistic is probably like 1 in 5 people, like 1 in 5 adults will be consensually non-monogamous at some point in their lifetimes. We all know someone. If you think of your most conservative normie friend, they know someone. They just don't know that they know someone, right? And so the more that we are able to be visible, the more that tide is going to turn, in my opinion.
Yeah, I read somewhere that as many people as own cats have or will have tried a consensual non-monogamy at some point. So if
like
you know someone who owns a
cats.
cat,
I like
Me
that.
too, so yeah.
That's how people are going to remember. Yeah.
Love it.
Emily was going to say something too before you got off. It'd be nice to have all 3 voices closing off the episode.
Sure. Yeah, I can say something. Yeah, as much of kind of a cesspool and a toxic environment social media is and has become, it has really afforded, I think, everyone the opportunity for visibility in a way that we never had before. And like Dedeker said, that's sort of just so important for us as, I guess, a group of people to be able to see others that may be different from us and be able to see, like, hey, they're doing, you know, things maybe in a different way from me, but that's okay. And it can be normalized and it can be sort of allow people to be curious about it and maybe read more about it or listen to a podcast on it or take little nuggets of advice from it, things like that. And so I think, you know, the kids are all right. The Gen Zers, they're doing something right because so many of them that I've met have really just gone to the extreme of saying, like, whatever it is that you want to do, is okay, and that's great. And I think that that's a huge step forward for the next generation of people out there.
Yep, there's hope for us all.
Indeed.
So, tell our listeners where they can follow up with you, and most importantly, where they can get your book.
Yeah, so we are Multiamory Podcast. You can find us at Multiamory on Twitter and on Facebook, and then Multiamory_podcast on Instagram. Also, our book, Multiamory Essential Tools for Modern Relationships, is available at multiamory.com/book, and really any major bookseller out there. So please check it out.
All right. Thank you so much for joining us today. It was such a pleasure to talk with you.
This was lovely. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank
Thank you
you.
for having us.
Bye.